The world sees the glossy version of me, the perfect life, the flawless smile. But behind the mask? It's chaos. Fame isn't a dream, it's a prison. Everyone wants a piece of me, but who am I when the cameras are off? When the noise fades, I'm left alone with the truth. And I'm not sure I can survive it. Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The airport was alive with its usual chaos. Luggage wheels rattled over tiled floors, voices echoed in a dozen different languages, and the intercom droned with flight updates no one seemed to hear. For once, I wasn't in the middle of the frenzy. I had managed to find a quiet corner of LAX, tucked away from the main terminal. My black hoodie and low baseball cap were doing their job, keeping me invisible. I leaned back in the uncomfortable chair, phone in hand, scrolling through news I wasn't really reading. The delay had stretched into hours, leaving me restless but oddly relieved. No cameras, no fans, no demands, just anonymity. That's rare when your face is plastered on billboards from New York to Tokyo. It wasn't that I didn't love my fans. They've given me everything, my career, my platform, my purpose. But sometimes, I crave quiet. I crave blending in, just being another guy trying to get from one place to another without being a spectacle. Today, that's all I wanted. The hum of the terminal started to fade into the background, and I let myself sink into the moment. Then, I noticed her. She was sitting by the window, knitting a bright yellow scarf. Her hands moved with practiced precision, the kind of rhythm that comes from years of doing something well. She wore a faded but neatly pressed coat, and though the world around her buzzed with noise and motion, she seemed untouched by it all. Calm. Graceful. I don't know why, but I couldn't stop watching her. There was something about the way she sat, so composed, like she carried the weight of something far heavier than the scarf in her lap. She reminded me of my grandma, with that quiet strength that doesn't need to shout to be heard. For a while, I just watched, letting her presence soothe the restlessness inside me. She was a little island of peace in the middle of the chaos. And then the peace shattered. Sharp voices cut through the hum of the terminal. Seriously, why is she just sitting there taking up space? Someone said, loud enough for half the lounge to hear. My stomach twisted. I looked up and saw them, a group of 3 business travelers, dressed sharp in their suits and heels, but their words were anything but polished. I mean, isn't there a senior center for people like her? One of the women sneered. I felt my chest tighten. Her. Ruth, as I would later learn her name was, didn't even flinch. Her hands kept knitting, but the tension in her shoulders gave her away. She heard them. She felt the sting of their words just as much as I did. The group laughed, their cruel commentary continuing. Bet she doesn't even know how to use the self-check-in kiosks. Slowing everyone down, one of the men added with a smirk. My hands clenched into fists. I didn't know her, but I knew what it was like to be judged. To be seen as less than you are because of someone else's ignorance. Part of me wanted to look away, to stay in my bubble of anonymity. After all, stepping in would mean drawing attention, becoming the center of something I wasn't ready for today. But another part of me, the louder part, knew I couldn't stay silent. Not this time. The decision was forming in my mind, but I wasn't ready to act just yet. Not until I saw what would happen next. I leaned forward in my seat, my heart pounding. This wasn't just another day at the airport anymore. I didn't want to get involved. Not at first. My head told me to stay in my corner, to let it blow over. After all, who was I to play the hero? I wasn't dressed for it, and I sure wasn't in the mood for the attention it would bring. But the longer I sat there, the louder my conscience got. The group's voices grew sharper, their mocking laughter cutting through the terminal like nails on a chalkboard. I glanced back at Ruth. She hadn't moved much, still knitting the yellow scarf, but her hands were shaking now. Her lips pressed together tightly, her eyes fixed on her work like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. That's when it hit me. This wasn't just about Ruth. It was about every time I'd seen something wrong and let it slide because I was too scared or too tired to act. This was my moment to make a choice, and for once, I didn't want to walk away. I stood up, pulling my hoodie tighter around my face as if that could shield me from what was about to happen. My legs felt shaky, my heart pounding in my chest, but I walked straight toward them. "Hey," I said, keeping my voice calm but firm. "That's enough." The group turned to look at me, their surprise quickly giving way to annoyance. The woman who had made the first comment crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing. "And who are you supposed to be?" I ignored the question, keeping my focus on Ruth. "Ma'am, are you okay?" I asked, my tone softening. She looked up at me then, her dark eyes filled with quiet dignity. "I'm fine, son," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I've dealt with worse." Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. She shouldn't have to deal with this, not now, not ever. I turned back to the group, my jaw tightening. "You need to leave her alone," I said. The man in the group laughed, the sound dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, great. Another white knight," he said. "What are you, her bodyguard?" I felt the heat rising in my chest. Part of me wanted to yell, to let all the frustration boil over, but I forced myself to stay calm. "It doesn't matter who I am," I said evenly. "What matters is that what you're doing is wrong." The woman rolled her eyes dramatically. "Please. We weren't even talking to her," she said. "People these days are so sensitive." I opened my mouth to respond, but before I could get the words out, someone from the crowd spoke up. "Wait a second, is that Justin Bieber?" The words hung in the air for a moment, and I felt the energy in the room shift. Heads turned. Phones came out. The quiet corner I'd been hiding in just minutes ago was gone, replaced by a growing murmur of recognition. The man in the group raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing on his lips. "Seriously? We're getting a morality lecture from a pop star now?" I hesitated. This wasn't how I'd wanted things to go. My anonymity was gone, and with it, any chance of handling this quietly. For a moment, I thought about retreating, slipping back into the crowd and letting the attention swallow me up. But then I glanced at Ruth again. Her knitting had stopped entirely, her hands resting in her lap as she watched me with a mix of curiosity and hope. I couldn't walk away. "Not now." "Yeah," I said, my voice louder now. "It's me. And I'm telling you to back off." The man laughed again, this time louder, clearly amused by the spectacle. "What's next?" he asked. "You gonna sing us a little protest song?" The crowd chuckled nervously, their phones still pointed in my direction. I could feel the pressure building, the weight of all those eyes and expectations pressing down on me. And then, like a switch flipping, I knew exactly what I had to do. I turned to Ruth. "Ma'am," I said, keeping my voice steady, "do you mind if I play something for you?" She blinked, clearly taken aback. "Well, I suppose that would be all right," she said, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. I reached into my carry-on bag and pulled out my acoustic guitar. The crowd murmured in anticipation, the tension in the room shifting slightly. I strummed a few chords, letting the sound fill the space, and then I began to sing. It wasn't a song anyone had heard before, just something I made up on the spot. The words came to me as I played, a melody built from the emotions swirling inside me. There's a place where we all belong. No matter the color, no matter the song. We're stronger together, hand in hand. Building a future where love can stand. The room fell silent. Even the business travelers, who had been so smug just moments ago, stood still, their expressions unreadable. As my voice soared, I glanced back at Ruth. She wasn't knitting anymore. Her hands rested in her lap, and her eyes glistened with unshed tears. The song ended, and for a moment, the terminal was completely still. Then, one by one, the crowd began to clap. The applause grew louder, filling the space with a warmth I hadn't felt in a long time. I set my guitar down and turned back to Ruth. "Are you okay now?" I asked softly. She smiled, her eyes meeting mine. "I'm better than okay," she said. "Thank you." But it wasn't over yet. I could still feel the eyes of the group on me, and I knew this was only the beginning. The applause from the crowd lingered in my ears as I turned to walk back to my seat. My heart was still racing, a mix of adrenaline and something else I couldn't quite place. A part of me was proud of standing up, of doing the right thing for once, but another part of me, the one I usually ignored, was screaming to retreat. I knew what was coming next. The murmurs of the crowd followed me as I made my way back to Ruth. She smiled at me, and for the first time, I saw her as more than just a stranger in a terminal. There was a grace in her, a depth to her calm presence. She hadn't needed me to save her, but somehow, I'd found myself pulled into her world. "You really didn't have to do that," she said, her voice soft, yet carrying an undeniable strength. "But I'm grateful." I shrugged, still feeling the sting of the attention. "It was the right thing to do," I said, trying to brush it off. But I couldn't. The thought of being stared at, having people point their cameras at me, it left a bitter taste in my mouth. Ruth, however, wasn't focused on me. She had already turned back to her knitting, her hands moving as though the drama had never happened. She seemed completely unfazed. I took a seat next to her, feeling more than a little out of place. We sat in silence for a while, the buzz of the terminal returning, but something in me wasn't at peace. The attention was growing. My phone buzzed with messages, dozens of notifications flooding my inbox, my social media lighting up like a Christmas tree. Most were supportive, but I could already tell from the comments and the posts that this was going to blow up. The airport incident was already being shared all over Twitter, Instagram, and even news outlets. I had a sinking feeling in my stomach. The world wasn't ready to let me be just another guy. They never were. "You okay?" Ruth asked suddenly, her voice pulling me out of my spiral. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just, not used to all this." I gestured vaguely to the terminal, but she knew what I meant. The truth was, I hated being the center of attention. I hated that my every move was watched, dissected, turned into a headline or a meme. But when I looked at Ruth, still sitting there so quietly, so untouched by the frenzy, I felt a strange sense of envy. She didn't need the world to approve of her. We were from different worlds, I realized. She had her own battles, but they didn't come with millions of eyes trained on her, waiting for her to slip up. The gate agent's voice crackled over the loudspeaker, announcing that our flight was finally boarding. I stood up quickly, ready to escape the ever-growing crowd. I felt eyes on me from every direction. Ruth stood up beside me, gathering her things slowly. "Where are you headed?" she asked as we made our way to the line. "New York," I said, trying to keep things casual. "You?" "I'm just passing through, but my family's there." "I haven't seen them in a while," she said, a faint smile crossing her face. I couldn't help but feel a little guilty. Here I was, about to board a flight to a whirlwind of meetings and press, while Ruth was just trying to make her way home. Something about that seemed wrong. The line started moving, and we shuffled forward, our feet echoing in time with the rush of footsteps around us. I glanced at Ruth again, her calm demeanor never wavering, and I knew I wanted to know more about her. There was something about her quiet strength that drew me in. But before I could say anything else, my phone buzzed again. A text. It was from my manager. "The press is already on it. We need you to handle the narrative before it spins out of control. Call me. I cursed under my breath. Ruth caught the movement, her eyes briefly flickering to my phone before meeting my gaze. She seemed to sense my frustration. Something wrong? She asked softly. I shook my head, stuffing the phone back into my pocket. Nothing. Just work stuff. We reached the gate, and the chaos of boarding engulfed us. My mind was a swirl of thoughts, of the crowd, of Ruth, of the inevitable press conference that would come once we landed. But as I followed her down the jetway, I couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, however brief, had changed something. Ruth had been a stranger just hours ago, but now, she felt like a tether to something real. Something honest. Something I hadn't realized I was missing. I glanced back at her, watching as she walked ahead, her yellow scarf still neatly folded in her arms. The moment the door closed and the plane started to taxi, I sat back in my seat and closed my eyes, trying to center myself. But deep down, I knew things had already begun to shift. The plane's engines roared to life as we took off, and for the first time in hours, I could feel the weight of my thoughts slowly easing. The sky outside the window was clear, the sun setting over the horizon, painting everything in shades of pink and orange. But my mind? It was still a storm, swirling with the chaos of everything that had happened, Ruth, the confrontation, the aftermath. I wasn't used to this kind of attention. I'd always kept my personal life private, and now, it felt like I had a spotlight on me wherever I went. The phone in my pocket buzzed again, but I ignored it. I'd deal with the press and the inevitable backlash once I landed. Right now, I just wanted to breathe. But the quiet that surrounded me on the plane wasn't enough to drown out my thoughts. I glanced to the seat next to me, and there she was, Ruth, sitting with her knitting again, completely unbothered by the chaos. It was like she didn't belong in this world. The world of flashing cameras, trending hashtags, and screaming headlines. She was a stark contrast to everything I knew. I turned toward the window again, the soft hum of the plane's engines providing a strange comfort. But Ruth's voice pulled me from my thoughts once again. I can't tell you how many times I've seen people like you, she said, her voice calm, but with a hint of something deeper. I frowned, unsure of where this was going. People like me? I asked, my tone guarded. Famous people. Or, people who think they're famous. She paused, letting the words sit in the air for a moment before adding, I used to think it would be amazing, you know? To have people care about everything you do, to have that kind of power. I turned to her then, her words sinking in. I hadn't expected that. Ruth wasn't someone who seemed to care about fame, or the superficial aspects of the world I lived in. But there was something in her voice, something familiar. And? I asked, genuinely curious. She shrugged, a small, rueful smile playing at her lips. And then I realized it's just noise. People only care until they don't. The second you mess up, they're on to the next story. Fame is like a mirror. It reflects the best parts of you, but also the worst. I didn't know how to respond to that. She was right, of course. Fame could be intoxicating, but it was also isolating, suffocating. People didn't care about the person, they cared about the image, the idea, the brand. I swallowed, feeling something shift inside me. Ruth's words were a wake-up call, but they also made me uncomfortable. I didn't know if I liked the idea that she saw me as just another famous person, another name on a list of trending topics. But there was a part of me that appreciated her honesty. You don't want any of this, do you? I asked, motioning to the plane, to the life I led. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she glanced out the window, watching the clouds drift by. I don't think I've ever wanted it. But I understand the pull. The temptation to be seen, to matter. Her voice softened, and she glanced back at me. But I don't think it's worth the price you have to pay. I let her words hang in the air between us, unsure of what to say. There was so much I wanted to ask, but part of me was afraid of the answers. Ruth didn't seem to care about my celebrity, my persona, my carefully curated image. She cared about something else, something real. I used to have a dream, she said suddenly, breaking the silence. A long time ago. I wanted to be an artist, travel the world, make things that mattered. I raised an eyebrow. What happened? She sighed, a wistful look crossing her face. Life. Family. Obligations. The things that hold you back, even when you know you want something else. So, I knit now. It's not as grand as I thought, but it's peaceful. I nodded, understanding more than I wanted to. I had my own dreams once, ones that had slipped away, buried under the weight of expectations, schedules, and the pressure of being something everyone else needed me to be. And you? Ruth asked, turning her gaze toward me now, her eyes steady. What's your dream? The question caught me off guard. I hadn't thought about it in so long, I wasn't even sure what my answer would be. For years, I'd been running from one thing to the next, never really stopping to think about why I was doing it all. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. I tried again, and finally, something clicked. I don't know anymore, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Ruth smiled softly. You'll figure it out. Everyone does eventually. But I wasn't sure about that. I wasn't sure I would figure it out, not in the way she seemed to think. The truth was, I didn't know what I wanted. Not anymore. Before I could respond, the flight attendants started their routine, preparing for the descent. The plane dipped slightly, and I leaned back in my seat, feeling the weight of everything we'd talked about. Ruth had turned her attention back to her knitting, but I could still hear her words echoing in my mind. This wasn't just a flight. It was a journey, not just to a new city, but into something I wasn't sure I was ready for. The plane began its descent, the lights of New York stretching out beneath us like a constellation of human ambition. As the city came into view, my pulse quickened, not just from the rush of landing, but from a different kind of nervousness. This was it. The moment everything would change. I hadn't expected to get into the deep stuff with Ruth. In fact, I hadn't expected to talk to her at all. But somehow, we had shared pieces of ourselves, ones I wasn't sure I even wanted to admit. I was still processing the conversation as the flight attendants went through the landing routine, securing the cabin. When the plane finally touched down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in me. I wasn't sure if it was just the fatigue setting in or if Ruth had actually gotten under my skin. Either way, it didn't matter. What I was about to face in New York was far more pressing. The moment we deplaned, I felt the cold air hit my skin. It was a sharp contrast to the warmth inside the cabin, and the starkness of it somehow felt like a metaphor for everything I was running from. I had become a person I didn't recognize, and now it was time to deal with the fallout. As we stepped into the terminal, Ruth moved ahead, her graceful stride cutting through the bustling crowd. I followed, lost in my own thoughts, but still keeping my distance. She wasn't the one I was running from, after all. We passed through customs and into the arrival lounge, where a few people were lingering, waiting for rides or loved ones. Ruth moved with the same quiet confidence she'd had on the plane. Are you meeting someone? I asked as she walked ahead, curiosity nudging at me. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes soft. Not really. My family's a little scattered at the moment. She paused. I'm just here for a bit of closure. Something in her voice tugged at me. Closure. It was a word that seemed to hang in the air with its own weight. It felt like a key, unlocking a door that I wasn't sure I was ready to open. But before I could ask anything more, my phone buzzed again. Where are you? The press is going wild. Get here. Now. It was from my manager. I cursed under my breath. I had been dreading this, dreading the moment I would be forced to face the consequences of my impulsive decision at the airport. The attention was overwhelming, and I wasn't sure I could handle it. Ruth noticed my change in expression. "Everything all right?" she asked. I nodded, forcing a smile that felt more like a grimace. "Yeah. Just work stuff." She didn't buy it, but didn't press the issue either. Instead, she turned to face the exit. "I guess I'll be heading out," she said, her tone light but with something beneath it that I couldn't quite grasp. I wasn't sure why, but I didn't want her to go. I'd spent so much of my life feeling disconnected from everyone around me, and Ruth was the first person in a long time who seemed to see through that. She didn't care about the celebrity, the persona. She just saw me. "Ruth, wait," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. She turned, her expression calm. "What is it?" I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but all I could think about was the mess waiting for me. The press. The scrutiny. The lies that would be spun. I didn't want to drag her into it. "Nothing," I said finally, shaking my head. "I'm just grateful, that's all." Ruth smiled softly, that same quiet understanding in her eyes. "You don't have to thank me." I wanted to tell her that I did have to thank her, that she had been a lifeline in the storm. But instead, I just stood there, watching her move toward the door, disappearing into the crowd. For a moment, I felt utterly alone. The noise of the terminal, the voices of people waiting for their bags, the distant sound of announcements, it all faded away, and it was just me and the weight of everything I was about to face. I swallowed hard and turned back toward the exit, dialing my manager's number. The call went through, and I heard the familiar, tense voice on the other end. "Where are you? We're already being asked about you. The media's going crazy." "I'm on my way," I said, my voice clipped. I could already hear the familiar buzz of paparazzi waiting outside the terminal, ready to snap their shots. "Give me 5 minutes." As I walked toward the door, the crowd pressing in from all sides, I knew one thing for certain: this was it. The moment I'd been avoiding was finally here. But for a split second, I wondered if maybe Ruth had been right. Maybe fame wasn't worth the cost. Maybe the noise really was too much. But before I could lose myself in the thought, I stepped outside into the cold New York night. And the cameras were already waiting. The flash of cameras hit me like a tidal wave as I stepped into the cold New York night. The harsh light was blinding, and the questions came at me in rapid succession, each one more invasive than the last. "What happened with your ex? Is the scandal true? Are you dating anyone?" I tried to ignore the chaos, but it was impossible. I could feel the weight of the questions pressing in on me, making my chest tighten. They weren't interested in the truth. They wanted the drama, the mess. They wanted to sell stories and tear me down, all for a headline. I pushed through the crowd of paparazzi, my mind racing. This is my life now, I thought bitterly. This is what I've built, this circus of noise and spectacle. A hand grabbed my arm, and I jerked back instinctively, my heart leaping in my chest. But it was only my manager, Alan, his face set in a permanent scowl. He was already drenched in sweat, his suit wrinkled from a long day of dealing with the fallout. "Come on, get in the car," he barked. His voice was low, tense, and I could tell he was as tired of this as I was. I didn't argue. I pushed through the remaining cameras and slid into the back seat of the black SUV waiting at the curb. Alan followed, slamming the door behind him. As the car sped away from the airport, the cacophony of flashing lights and distant voices faded. But I could still feel their weight. I could still hear the questions echoing in my mind. What happened to your perfect life? What happened to the fairy tale? Alan was already on his phone, barking orders into the speaker. His voice was muffled by the sounds of traffic, but I could hear the tension in his words. We need a statement. Now. Get the lawyers on it. No more leaks. He paused, glancing at me. Are you okay? I didn't answer right away. Instead, I turned my face toward the window, watching the blur of light streak past. I didn't know what I was feeling anymore, just numb. I should have been used to this by now, the constant noise, the never-ending scrutiny. But tonight, it felt different. It felt like the walls were closing in. What are we going to do? I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Alan sighed, putting his phone down. We'll get ahead of the story, like always. We'll release a statement, control the narrative, and move on. He looked at me, his eyes hard but not unkind. You've handled worse. His words were meant to reassure me, but they only made me feel smaller, more trapped. Handle it, he'd said. Control the narrative. Like I was a product, a headline to be shaped and packaged. But none of it felt real anymore. What if I don't want to handle it? I muttered, almost to myself. I turned away from the window to face him. What if I'm done? Alan blinked, thrown off by my sudden outburst. Done? He raised an eyebrow, clearly not understanding. What do you mean, done? I shook my head, feeling the weight of the question settle in my chest. I mean done. Done with the interviews, the constant pressure, the cameras, the lies. I don't know who I am anymore. I'm just a brand, Alan. A product. What happened to me? Alan leaned back in his seat, clearly uncomfortable with where the conversation was going. You're fine. You'll bounce back. You always do. But I didn't feel fine. I felt like I was drowning. My whole life had become a series of curated moments for the world to consume, but none of it was real. None of it was mine. I wanted to scream. I wanted to rip away the mask I had been wearing for years, the one that everyone expected me to wear. But I couldn't. The pressure, the expectations, they were too heavy, too ingrained in me. But somewhere in the back of my mind, Ruth's words echoed. Fame is like a mirror. It reflects the best parts of you, but also the worst. I wanted to argue with her, to dismiss her as naive. But the truth was, she had a point. The more I tried to keep up the facade, the more I felt like I was losing myself. What if I want to disappear? I said, almost in a daze. Alan looked at me like I'd just spoken a foreign language. You can't just disappear. You have a career to think about, a future. Your brand. I held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. I'm tired, Alan. Tired of being everything to everyone. Tired of the brand. The car fell silent for a few moments as we passed the familiar cityscape, the flashing billboards and towering skyscrapers, a constant reminder of the world I was trapped in. Finally, Alan sighed. Look, we'll figure it out. You don't have to be perfect, but you do have to keep it together for now. This storm will pass. I didn't know if I believed him, but I nodded anyway. For now, it was all I could do. As we neared the hotel, my phone buzzed again. Another notification. Another headline. Another piece of my life ripped apart for public consumption. Celebrity scandal, reality stars meltdown, what's next? The headline burned into my mind, and I knew, this was the price of fame. The car pulled into the hotel's private entrance, and I stepped out into the cold night air, the weight of everything pressing down on me. Alan followed behind, his voice already talking business again, but I wasn't listening. The world had changed, but I was still the same. And for the first time, that scared me more than anything.